Let's take a look at another hybrid MSS main conclusion question. Once again, the question says which of the following most logically completes the argument. And here we see the blank. And crucially, we see this word thus preceding the blank, telling us that the information they want us to supply into the blank is receiving support. In other words, forms the conclusion of the argument. So let's take a look at the stimulus. Proponents of electric car maintain that when the technical problems associated with its battery design are solved, such cars, referential phrasing, right? Electric cars will be widely used, and because they referencing the electric cars, because they are emissions free, they will result in an abatement of the environmental degradation caused by auto emissions. Okay, that's quite a lot of information, right? It's 5-6 lines of information. And I hope you noticed that the author is reporting to us what other people are saying. In other words, this may not be the author's position. And in fact, as it turns out, on the LSAT, it rarely is. And you can already see that, right? The author says, oh, this is what other people say, but, right, but. So here I'm going to label this other people's position / context, contextual information. It's in this context, it's in response to the other people's position that our author will make her argument, right? So, but before we get to her argument, let's make sure we understand the proponent's position. They are fans of electric cars. They're saying, yes, we understand that there's some technical problems associated with battery design, but let's just assume that those get solved, right? And once those get solved, there will be wide adoption of electric cars, and that's going to be great because electric cars are emissions free, right? They're emissions free, and that's going to result in the abatement of the environmental degradation caused by auto emissions. So what they have in mind is something like this. Currently, this is the status quo. We have cars that produce emissions. But once we switch over to electric cars, which are emissions free, that's good, right? Emissions here, no emissions there. Okay, fair enough. Now let's see how our author responds. She says, but unless we dam more rivers, electricity to charge these batteries will come from nuclear coal-fired power plants. So the first point she makes is that, look, I think you're forgetting that these cars don't power themselves, right? Sure, these are electric cars. They run on electricity, but where does electricity come from? Where does the electricity that these cars run on, where does it come from? Well, it comes from power plants, right? Power plants, like either coal-fired power plants or nuclear power plants or hydropower plants, okay? And each of these three power sources produce considerable environmental damage. So the author is saying that you really don't have a choice to avoid all three of these types of power plants, power generation. Right? Because, and here is the usage of unless, right? Unless you dam more rivers, you have to pick between these two. Meaning if you don't dam, let's say you don't want to dam more rivers, right? Fine. We don't want to dam more rivers, right? Remember, negate sufficient. Then what are you left with? Well, then now you got to pick one of these two, either nuclear or coal. Okay. Alternatively, let's say we don't want to pick this one, right? We don't want nuclear and we don't want coal. So we're negating this one, negate sufficient. Then what? Then you have to dam more rivers. So you see how this unless is operating? It's operating in the sense that of these three methods of generating power, either hydro or nuclear or coal, the author is saying you have to pick at least one of them, right? Because that's how you're going to supply the electricity that the car needs to run. And guess what? Each of these three, each of them produces considerable environmental damage, right? So I'm not sure if emissions is the right word, but I'll just say pollution. And now finally we arrive at the conclusion. What's the conclusion? Well, first I want you to consider these three answers and see if you like any of them, right? And we'll do this in turn. B says will probably remain less popular than other types of cars. Thus, the electric car will be less popular, right? Less popular than non-electric cars, whatever that means. I suppose it means just your regular gas-powered cars, right? Gasoline cars. Now, do you think this conversation is leading to this conclusion? Do you think that the author setting up this context, responding in this way about, hey, you got to think about where the power for this comes from, is leading to the conclusion about electric cars' popularity? No, it's not. Okay, it's not. It's not, B is not inconsistent with the argument, meaning there's really nothing here that says that electric cars will be more popular, but there's also nothing here that says electric cars will be less popular. Just think about this idea of popularity. What does this idea turn on? In other words, what influences popularity? I don't know, the cost? I would imagine cost is the big factor. How expensive are these electric cars? Are they expensive or cheap? If it's cheaper, I'd imagine they'd be more popular. Right? How do they look? Do they look cool or do they look silly? I imagine that influences popularity. Are they safe? I'd imagine that influences popularity. These are like none of those things are addressed. Whereas you'd expect those things to be addressed if you're concerned, if your chief conclusion was about the car's popularity. Right? So this is not a good answer choice. Let's move on to C. Thus, the electric car requires that purely technical problems be solved before it can succeed. Well, somebody in here would agree with this because somebody in here pretty much said it. Right? And that's the proponents. The proponent's like, yeah, I just said that. You know, we have technical problems associated with battery design. We do need to solve them, but once they are solved, then something, right? And C is kind of parroting that point. Requires that purely technical problems, for example, battery design, be solved before it can succeed. Yes, but is that what the author's driving at? Talking about, hey, you forgot where the electricity, the powers electric cars comes from these. Each of these has its own pollution issues. So wait, let's circle back to your first point about, something you already said. No, that doesn't make any sense. How about D? Thus, the electric car will increase the total level of emissions rather than reduce it. What do you think about that? I would say that D is better than B and C in that at least the subject matter is on point. We are talking about emissions, thank goodness, right? D seems to be following the conversation. But what about the way that D talks about emissions? Do you think the author is saying, okay, look, the electric car will increase total emissions? The author recognizes that the transition from conventional gasoline power cars over to electric cars means that there will be a reduction in emission at the car level, right? At the car level. I don't think she contests the point. I mean, it will be a silly hill to die on to say that electric cars also has emissions. No, it just doesn't, right? But the author is reminding the proponents that, look, this electricity isn't coming for free. And the source of this power itself has environmental considerations. Right? Not necessarily emissions. And look at the language here. Each of these three, considerable environmental damage. Right? Not necessarily emissions. Okay, so maybe you picked up on that and that's why you got rid of D, and that would be a good reason to get rid of D. Now, there is another reason why D doesn't work. And to see that, I want to look at A and E as well, because one of these two answers, the wrong one, shares in the other error that D commits. Right, so A says will have worse environmental consequences than its proponents may believe, and E says will not produce a net reduction in environmental degradation. Notice that they both sidestep the error that D commits by talking in more general terms. Right, environmental consequences, environmental degradation. These are terms that are broader than just emissions. Emission is just one type of environmental degradation. Right, I mean, for a nuclear facility, I'd imagine the environmental consequences is not so much emissions, rather it's about, how to store nuclear waste safely, how to prevent a nuclear meltdown. For hydro plants, I'd imagine it's something about like how, what if you disrupt downstream ecosystems or mess up upstream ecosystems or something like that, right? Okay, for coal plants, maybe it is about emissions, right? Coal is probably emissions. But anyway, the point is, A and E are better than D for sidestepping this error, but one of them still contains another error, right? It's an error that D contains as well. Which one is it? Well, you have to get clear on what the author is talking about in terms of the comparison, right? Is the author comparing the status quo world of gasoline power cars and how much environmental degradation it's putting out against the world of electric cars plus whatever its source of generation and how much environmental degradation it's putting out, right? That's one comparison. Or is the author more concerned about the proponent's idea of an electric world versus the reality of an electric world? Okay, those are two very different comparisons. Let me say that again. One comparison is if you think the author is concerned about the status quo world compared against the real, with the full implications, right? The full implications of an electric car world. That's one comparison. Another comparison is the proponent's perception of an electric world versus the reality of the electric world. Do you see that? Those are different comparisons. And it's this one that our author is concerned with, which means A is the right answer, E is not the right answer. See, A says the electric car will have worse environmental consequences than its proponents may believe. That's precisely the response to the proponent's claims. The proponent's perception is that once you transition, it's just pure gain, right? It's just purely better because you're just losing emissions, that the cars are producing all this emission, we're just losing it. That's it, end of story. That's what the proponents believe. And the author's response is a reminder to the proponents that these cars aren't free to operate, so to speak, right? You have to remember that these cars get their power from somewhere. So this is the full picture reality. And the full picture reality has environmental consequences, negative ones that you fail to consider, which is why the electric car will have worse environmental consequences than what you believe, right? That's definitely supported because what you believe doesn't include the pollution that comes from the power plants. But the reality does include the pollution that comes from the power plants. Now contrast that with E, which says, thus the electric car will not produce a net reduction in environmental degradation. You see, this is not about the proponent's perception, the proponent's beliefs, in other words. This is just straight up about reality. E is just about comparing the status quo world of gasoline-powered cars versus a transition to a regime of full electric, right? Full electric means full electric. Okay, the reality, as the author pointed out, the reality is all this, right? Okay, so on the one hand, in the status quo world, you have all the emissions coming from all these millions, hundreds of millions of cars. Yeah, we lose that. Fine, that's good for the environment. But in the electric world, you do get extra pollution from the power plants. Now, in order to figure out in net what happens, you have to compare this to this, which is the better deal. Maybe I'll take this if it means that this is less pollution than this, or maybe I won't take this if it turns out that this actually is the less pollution than this. But the point is, I don't know. I don't know because the author doesn't talk about it. And why doesn't the author talk about it? Precisely because that's not her point. She's not trying to say that, look, you shouldn't transition because, this is the better deal. Nor is she trying to say you should transition because this is the better deal. Do you see that? That's why E isn't right. And that's what I meant earlier about D having another mistake. Even if you fix this emissions and call it environmental, use this word, right? Environmental degradation. Well, that's just the same thing. D still is wrong in the same way that E is wrong now, because that's not what the author is talking about. Author is actually just trying to talk about the proponent's perception of reality versus actual reality.